Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Tanuja Ramachandran, Hunter Seeker, by Kumar Sivasubramanian, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Imagine a hat made out of cheese. A man makes these cheese hats. What good are they? Who wants them? No one. A way to deal with all your cheese, I guess. But the cheese hat maker, hell, he's forgot how to do anything but make cheese hats. No good for anything else. So one day you're going to end up with a room full of them, stinking the place up, suffocating you, and you're going to have to face the music. What we've got on our hands here is a cheese hat maker, only she doesn't make cheese hats. She fills chumps full of lead. Srikanth Jayalakshmi, transcribed from a secret recording made on the occasion of her dismissal in the office of his successor, Leopold Vishwanathan. October 2013. Though it was doomed to go all wrong, she couldn't have asked for a better killing ground. In Montreal's old, abandoned, and dilapidated warehouse district, a woman could slaughter people by the dozens with as much gunfire and screaming as she wanted, and no one would give a shit. After the GFC, the entire area had gone to seed and had since been replaced by a more modern industrial park closer to the highways that connected Montreal to New Brunswick, the rest of Quebec, and Ontario. Some of the old factories and warehouses were full of Montreal's most fecund wildlife: cockroaches, rats, pigeons, raccoons, squatters. Some sank under the icy weight of the black autumn sky and could be heard groaning for death, even from a distance. This one looked just as dilapidated, but was guarded by a gate, and at the building's entrance, two young men of South Indian descent on watch. They were dressed like bouncers at a Mumbai doof club that could be heard for blocks around. Their guns should have been hidden, but they both held them out for anyone to see, fingers on the triggers like they were the latches on the red barrier rope. The power to decide whether you were good-looking enough to go inside and get drunk to word up a cameo was entirely in their hands. And yet, despite this, Tanuja Ramachandran walked right towards them, the cool breeze caressing and shifting her dark sari as she moved. At first, they didn't even see her, even though it was their only job, because they were too busy philosophizing. "Rajiv," the younger man said, "do you think Princess Kate's baby is cute?" The reply came from the angular silhouette of Rajiv in the dim moonlight. "Shut up, you piece of shit." "It's so cold, Rajiv. I need to talk for distraction." "Who the fuck is Princess Kate?" "She's Princess Diana's daughter. She married that Baldy. Don't you know anything? She had a baby George, just a few months ago." Tanuja's spectral figure melted out of the darkness, and the two men became all business, guns pointed at her in the same instant. Both of them had killed before, back in Chennai, in the slums and in the alleys. "Stop right there," the royalist commanded. "You shouldn't be in here, lady." "Who the shit are you?" spat Rajiv. As she came closer, the first man's brow crinkled. "Rajiv," he whispered, "didn't Mr. Banerjee say something about a woman in a sari?" Rajiv remembered something like that, but what was it? It didn't seem important at the time. Mr. Banerjee was a great man, an important man, but he could sometimes go off on long tangents. "I thought Vijay was guarding the gate," the younger one said, whispering again. Rajiv had thought of that too. It could be nothing. What could this woman do to that truck-sized man, Vijay? Nothing. Maybe he went for a piss. Right? "Stop or we'll shoot!" It was too late. In the next second, she clamped one hand over the younger one's mouth and decapitated Rajiv with an ornate 8-inch, 300-year-old blade that came out of her purse. The weapon went back into her purse in the same second. The young man stood frozen in place, his eyes as round as Ladu's, as if he were held there by a beam of fire shooting out of the poppy-red tattoo on her forehead. When he finally found the presence of mind to pull the trigger, she took the gun out of his hands before he could, like it had only been held there by Velcro. "She's no princess," she told him. Then she flicked her wrist, and the crunch of his neck filled the air like a mushroom cloud. The sound of his body slumping to the ground was followed by the clopping of hooves. Tanuja looked up and saw Lakshmibai, the Rani Queen of Jhansi, up on her horse Sarangi in full Sawar cavalry armor and with her 9-year-old son tied to her back so he didn't fall off. Lakshmibai wobbled her head at Tanuja and smiled approvingly. "Very best," she proclaimed, but her breath made no vapor in the cold autumn air because she wasn't there. "Now go inside," the Rani ordered, "and kill the rest of them." Inside, Tanuja shot the first thug right in the peepee. With only the distant light spilling from the office at the other end of the factory floor to work with, she was off target. Rather than being dead, the sentry crumpled into a Freudian fetal position, his hopes for future generations leaking out onto the factory floor. The gunshot and his screams attracted a dozen alarmed troopers spilling in from other parts of the factory. There were former militiamen who'd come from across the subcontinent, not rudderless Gonda thugs. Many were raw recruits, but motivated enough to drag their asses all the way to Montreal. The jokers were armed with buck-hunting rifles. They were runtish, too. Pickings must be getting slim, Tanuja thought between blasts. Some of the older ones recognized her and threw down their guns and fled. The others kept swarming down between the aisles created by rows of partial mannequins suspended from overhead runners like a robotic meat locker. There was no adrenaline rush for her as they toppled in dead clumps. It was like riding the same roller coaster over and over again. There was just the sense of compulsion. Tanuja switched her Vitshov 727 to semi-auto and swooped forward, spraying the room, her ropey panther-like biceps throbbing as the machine gun rolled and the rounds churned through flesh. Through her earplugs, the sound was like a continuous subterranean thudding that could be ignored, but she scrunched her nose at the stench of processed plastic permeating the gunpowder. With each dive, swivel, and weave, her braids swung to and fro, and the loose end over the shoulder, the pallu, of her onyx black and azure sari flapped violently. Her index finger pulsed against the trigger. Around her, the haughty, headless mannequins and disembodied plastic limbs watched with indifference, the unlucky ones exploding into powder when the bullets smashed into them. Her clip would be empty in a matter of seconds. Enough rounds had hit the mark that she was at least slowing them down. But something was creeping in at the edge of her awareness. These thugs, these Gundas, were staying up for longer than they normally did. Some were even getting back up again, and was draining more of her stamina than she'd expected. For an instant, the thought of her meds flashed into her consciousness. She hadn't taken her prescription for her sleeping problem because it worsened her aim, but now regret was creeping in. There were 3 men still standing, plus one she'd lost track of. Sloppy. One of them she shot clear through the head and could swear she saw a tuft of fur fly out. That was unusual. To her left, she spotted a door with a small window at eye level. She went in and locked the door behind her to regroup and reload. Inside, there was enough light coming in from street lamps outside to make out well-cluttered workbenches, sanders, rows of work aprons and filter masks, plaster and paint stains everywhere, scattered plastic arms and legs and heads and torsos. She heard the voices of the Gundas outside shouting at each other, coordinating the hunt. Then she noticed a door on another wall of the room. Before she could process it, she dove behind a workbench and the door burst open. Men poured in, firing in chaotic bursts, turning everything they hit into dust. They all stopped to reload at the same time, and it was the last thing they ever did. Tanuja went back out through the door they'd opened for her, and which led back out into the factory floor and the aisles of plastic bodies. She tossed the now empty Vitso aside, and in the same instant, the thug she'd lost track of from before pounced on her from the side. 4 limbs together with the acrobatic precision of a spider. Her head cracked against a conveyor belt and then the concrete floor. She found herself staring up at the marble-smooth crotch of a bald mannequin with blue eyeshadow, but everything screamed yellow and crimson. When the spider leapt on her again, her conditioned body blindly caught him midair in a Caligari Payatu grapple and swung him to the ground while using him as a counterweight to flip herself upright. In the next instant, the palu of her sari was around his neck, and a second later came the snap and the slump of death. She scrambled for cover behind some of the long shut-down factory equipment and pulled a Bastig 45 from the small of her back that had been tucked into her underskirt. 2 men were still firing at her. When she wiped her forehead, the back of her hand came away slick with blood. Without looking, she pointed the Bastig backwards over her shoulder and emptied the clip. She dared a peek around the machine and could see panic in the lit office at the other end of the factory floor. People gathering documents, smashing computers, and fleeing. But there was order to the panic. Directing the chaos was a tall gentleman from Kerala with a vulture-like face and a sharp suit, still composed but rushing them out the door under barked commands. She cursed under her breath and reloaded. When their boss disappeared through the back door of the office, the gunmen on the factory floor started to pull back too, as if pulled in his wake. She took the opportunity to leap out. The shots from her pistol screamed and flashed in the darkness, like gunpowder-filled hamsters smashed with a hammer. The men fell in the strobe-like flashes of light from their own weapons. Tanuja charged up the steps to the office, the steel stairs clanging under her sandals, and went through the back door, following the Carolyn's path. It opened onto a short corridor with a stairwell visible behind a door still swinging at one end. She went through it and up to the roof. Up there, in the autumn darkness, everything frosted by the gleam of reflected moonlight, the vulture man was climbing into a helicopter. But the chopper wasn't going to start. She'd seen to that well beforehand. Even now, the Carolyn was yelling at the pilot as he looked at the controls in dismay. They turned toward her as she came out of the stairwell. The Carolyn ducked out of the way, and the pilot started to pull a machine gun from under his seat. Tanuja got him on the third shot. It seemed to be over. The Carolyn straightened and watched her walk towards him as though he were an unmoving planetary body pulling her into his gravitational field. He remained as still as a meditating sannyasi. This was how he was going to die? So be it. Banerjee, she said flatly, as if naming this moment, the moment of his death. But a few meters away from him, she stopped. She rubbed her eyes with one hand, the other still pointing the gun at him. Then she looked at his sneering face with a scowl of her own, lowered the gun like a rag doll, and then crumpled to the ground and had a sleep. The plate on the door of the office in the embassy building read Leopold Vishwanathan. The plate on the oak desk said Leopold Vishwanathan. But the woman sitting behind the desk and across from Tanuja was not Leopold Vishwanathan. She was Nandini Shastri, tall, straight-backed, with a noble face. She was a silver-haired elder stateswoman with a storied career at the embassy and a laugh that charmed weaker minds. She was impossible to like. They had not said one word to each other since Tanuja had entered the office 2 minutes earlier, and Shastri gestured for her to sit. The stillness was a relief to her aching, bruised muscles. Just that morning, she'd slept with a man whose name she couldn't remember to calm her nerves, but it hadn't helped. And Rani Lakshmibai hadn't improved. Behind Shastri, leaning against the shelf of antique leather-bound Indian classics, was a mousy, clear-skinned man with a round face and a smug expression. He was a few years younger than Tanuja, and he wore a cheap suit. His presence drew a sneer from Tanuja of a slightly different angle than the "I smell a fart" sneer she usually had on her face. Shastri sat with an index finger steepled over her lips, staring at Tanuja. On the desk was a manila folder with her name stenciled on it. Outside the arched windows, the skies over Montreal were a milky Cadbury purple, leaden and inedible. Tanuja didn't need to be told what had happened to Leopold. But when Shastri broke the silence in her clear, authoritative voice, she told her anyway. Leopold Vishwanathan has been let go. So Leo got fired and you got demoted? Tanuja asked. If Shastri was stung by the insult, she buried any sign of it so deep, she'd be shitting it out within the hour, and went on unperturbed. You were his project, and frankly, I'd rather not have to resort to employing a 40-year-old narcoleptic mercenary. It's not technically narcolepsy. I know that, Miss Ramachandran, from our previous torturous conversations, and we've all read your dossier. She flipped it open and rifled through it. Even in 2013, Indian bureaucracy dragged everything down onto paper. 6 months undercover in Kabul at age 16. 4 years in Kashmir. 1 year fighting in a Gorkha military unit, Oxford educated, Black Ops in Sri Lanka. Somehow had time for a family in between all that. Assignments all over for the Indian government before settling in Montreal in 2004. Black belt level martial artist in Kalapayattu, Salambam, and Varma Adi. Firearms expertise level 8. She held up a medical page and squinted at Something that's basically narcolepsy. Narcofa something. None of which exonerates you from the boner you pulled in this operation. There was a snicker from behind her. Day! The intelligence was garbage, Tanuja said. There was nothing right about it except the spelling. There were more men there than I was told to expect, and they seemed strange. The words were a lure, but Shastri did not take the bait. If Leopold screwed you, why do you care so much that he's gone? Who said I cared? He was the lesser of two evils. Besides, his information came from higher up. Shastri gave her an avuncular smile. In all their encounters, this was the closest Tanuja had ever seen her come to flinching. Nevertheless, she continued, you fell asleep and Banerjee got away. Perhaps the most notorious terrorist in India's history. You fell asleep. You fell asleep. She tapped out the words in an angry, corrupted Morse code on her desk as she spoke. You cocked this up. Another guffaw from the little man behind her. I finished my missions. I'll finish this one. Despite the bad intel? She taunted. Shastri nodded to herself for a long moment, her mind working. Finally, she said out loud, I would hire someone else, but you've killed most of them. Tanuja cackled, genuinely. Apart from the dossier on the desk between them, everything that happened in this office was off the books. Some of the top embassy officials had gotten into the habit of employing mercenaries to solve certain problems. It worked, even if higher-ups like Shastri didn't always like to admit it. But it was also illegal that the hired guns effectively had the advantage. If their embassy handlers didn't meet their demands, they could threaten to go public. The embassy could barely complain about anything, unless a personality like Shastri's was in play. Guess who hired me to kill those people? Tanuja asked. We're in the business of troubleshooting before trouble shoots us, Shastri conceded. It was also effectively the reason the embassy was trying to crush Banerjee themselves instead of reporting his presence in the country to the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service. If it got out that a nefarious Indian terrorist was on Canadian soil, every Indian and brown person nationwide would suffer for it.